Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. Many believe the stock market crash of 1929 was the singular event that triggered the Great Depression, but is that the whole story? While Black Tuesday marked a dramatic collapse in investor confidence, the roots of the Great Depression ran much deeper. The 1930s economic crisis wasn't just the result of one bad day on Wall Street. It was a slow-moving disaster set in motion by years of poor financial policies, structural weaknesses in the economy, and global instability. The Great Depression remains one of the darkest periods in American history. Banks collapsed, businesses shuttered, and millions of people found themselves out of work with no safety net. Breadlines and soup kitchens became common sights in major cities, and entire families lost their homes, forced to live in makeshift shantytowns known as Hoovervilles. The crisis devastated not only the United States, but also economies around the world, leading to mass poverty, political upheaval, and ultimately the conditions that would pave the way for World War II. But was the stock market crash really to blame for all of this? The reality is far more complex. The Great Depression was the result of a chain reaction of economic missteps, policy failures, and global factors that compounded into a catastrophic downturn. Years of reckless speculation, income inequality, and a fragile banking system created an unstable foundation. When the crash happened, it wasn't the cause. It was the spark that ignited an already crumbling economy. In this video, we'll break down the deeper causes of the Great Depression, the warning signs that were ignored, and the devastating impact it had on millions of lives. By the end, you'll see that the Great Depression wasn't just a sudden accident. It was a disaster waiting to happen. After World War I, America entered a period of unprecedented economic growth. The 1920s, often called the Roaring Twenties, were defined by rapid industrial expansion, technological innovation, and a booming stock market. The U.S. emerged from the war as a global economic leader, with industries like automobile manufacturing, electrical appliances, and mass entertainment revolutionizing daily life. At first glance, it seemed like an era of unlimited prosperity. But beneath the surface, deep economic problems were taking root, problems that would ultimately contribute to the Great Depression. The post-war boom and mass production. The 1920s saw incredible advancements in production methods, especially with the rise of assembly line manufacturing. Henry Ford's revolutionary approach to car production made automobiles more affordable and accessible to ordinary Americans. By the end of the decade, millions of Americans owned cars, fueling the growth of related industries like oil, steel, rubber, and road construction. Other industries like radio, household appliances, and cinema flourished as technology improved, and consumer demand skyrocketed. Electricity became more common in households, allowing Americans to buy new gadgets like vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, and washing machines. The economy seemed unstoppable, and businesses kept expanding to meet growing consumer needs. Stock market speculation, a house of cards. With the economy booming, people saw the stock market as a way to get rich quickly. Unlike earlier periods, investing wasn't just for the wealthy. Ordinary Americans began pouring their savings into stocks, confident that prices would keep rising. But much of this investing was done on margin, meaning people were borrowing money to buy stocks. For as little as 10% down, investors could control large amounts of stock, gambling that rising prices would allow them to sell at a profit before repaying their loans. The problem? Stock prices weren't rising due to business performance. They were rising because of speculation. Investors were essentially betting on stocks rather than making sound financial decisions. This created an economic bubble where stock values became disconnected from reality. Companies were overvalued, and people were buying stocks not because the businesses were successful, but because they assumed prices would keep going up indefinitely. It was a classic case of irrational exuberance, an economy driven by optimism rather than sustainability. Easy credit and overproduction, a recipe for disaster. The economic boom of the 1920s was fueled by easy access to credit. People weren't just borrowing to invest in the stock market. They were also using credit to buy consumer goods like cars, radios, and household appliances. Installment plans allowed people to purchase expensive items with small monthly payments, making it seem as though everyone could afford a luxurious lifestyle. However, there was a major flaw in this system. Wages weren't keeping up with rising production. While businesses expanded and profits soared, workers' incomes remained stagnant. As a result, more and more Americans relied on credit to afford the products they wanted. This led to an economic imbalance. Factories kept producing more goods, but consumers were reaching their borrowing limits, meaning demand was not as strong as it seemed. At the same time, agriculture, one of the largest sectors of the American economy, was struggling. Farmers had overproduced crops during World War I to meet wartime demand, but when the war ended, prices plummeted, leaving many farmers deep in debt. While urban areas enjoyed prosperity, rural America was in crisis, with farm foreclosures and bankruptcies increasing throughout the decade. The growing wealth gap. Despite the image of prosperity, wealth in the 1920s was not evenly distributed. The richest 1% of Americans controlled nearly 40% of the nation's wealth, while millions of working-class Americans struggled to make ends meet. Industrial workers and farmers faced low wages, rising debts, and unstable employment, while business owners and stock market investors saw their wealth multiply. The economy relied on consumer spending, but with most of the money concentrated at the top, many Americans simply couldn't keep up. This growing divide between rich and poor was one of the biggest warning signs of an unstable economy. A truly strong economy requires a broad base of consumers with purchasing power, but in the 1920s, much of the wealth was locked up in the hands of a small elite. As soon as stock prices faltered and consumer debt caught up with spending, the economic boom would unravel, and that's exactly what happened at the end of the decade. A bubble ready to burst, the 1920s appeared to be a golden age of prosperity, but in reality, it was an economy built on a fragile foundation of speculation, easy credit, overproduction, and deep income inequality. People believed that the stock market would keep rising forever, that businesses would keep expanding, and that consumer demand would always be there. But the economy's weaknesses were already showing. Demand for goods was slowing, wages weren't keeping up, and the stock market was dangerously overvalued. All it took was one shock to bring the entire system crashing down. When the stock market collapsed in October 1929, it wasn't just a bad day for investors. It exposed the fundamental weaknesses of the decade's economic policies. The Roaring Twenties had been built on a financial bubble, and when that bubble burst, it sent the entire country spiraling into the worst economic crisis in history. The stock market crash. A spark, not the fire. By the late 1920s, the U.S. economy had been riding a wave of prosperity for nearly a decade. The stock market had become a symbol of this success, with share prices soaring to unprecedented heights. Millions of Americans, rich and poor alike, had invested in stocks, many using borrowed money under the assumption that prices would always rise. But this optimism was built on a fragile foundation of speculation, easy credit, and economic imbalances. When the market finally cracked, it sent shockwaves through the financial system. Black Tuesday. The day the bubble burst, the crash didn't happen all at once. The stock market had been showing signs of instability for weeks before the final collapse. On October 24, 1929, Black Thursday, investors began to panic as stock prices dipped sharply. Banks and wealthy financiers tried to restore confidence by buying large amounts of stock to stabilize prices, but the effort was short-lived. The real disaster came on October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday, when investors completely lost faith in the market. Panic set in, and millions of shares were sold in a desperate attempt to cut losses. By the end of the day, over 16 million shares had been traded, and the stock market had lost nearly 25% of its value in just a few days. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, which had reached an all-time high of 381 in early September, fell to 198 by mid-November, wiping out billions of dollars in wealth almost overnight. For many ordinary investors, this was devastating. Countless Americans had bought stocks on margin, meaning they had borrowed money to invest. When stock prices collapsed, they were left with massive debts and no way to repay them. Those who had poured their life savings into the market saw their financial security vanish in an instant. The sense of optimism that had defined the 1920s was shattered. The role of banks. A financial system on the brink, while the stock market crash was catastrophic for investors, it was the failure of the banking system that turned it into an economic disaster. In the 1920s, many banks had invested depositors' money in the stock market. When the crash hit, banks lost huge sums of money, and suddenly they didn't have enough cash to cover customer withdrawals. As news of the market collapse spread, people rushed to withdraw their savings in what became known as a bank run. The problem? Banks didn't keep all of their customers' money in cash. Most of it was loaned out or invested. With too many people demanding their money at once, banks couldn't meet the withdrawals and were forced to close. This had a cascading effect. When banks failed, people lost their savings, businesses lost access to loans, and economic activity ground to a halt. Between 1930 and 1933, over 9,000 banks failed across the U.S., wiping out billions of dollars in savings. Unlike today, there was no federal insurance protecting bank deposits. If your bank went under, your money was gone forever. This loss of financial security devastated ordinary Americans and destroyed trust in the banking system, worsening the economic collapse. Why the crash alone didn't cause the depression? Stock market crashes weren't new. There had been financial panics before, and none had caused anything close to the Great Depression. For example, in 1907, the stock market lost nearly 50% of its value, but the economy recovered quickly. So why was 1929 different? The answer lies in the deeper weaknesses of the economy. The stock market crash was just a trigger. The real causes of the Great Depression were already in place. Here's why the crash alone wasn't enough to cause the worst economic downturn in history. The economy was already fragile. The 1920s boom had been built on speculation, easy credit, and overproduction. Consumers were maxed out on debt. Businesses were producing more goods than people could afford, and the wealth gap was growing. Even before the crash, agriculture and rural economies were in crisis. The crash simply exposed these underlying problems. The banking collapse made things worse. In past financial crises, the banking system had remained strong enough to support economic recovery. But in 1929, banks were deeply involved in the stock market and completely unprepared for the crisis. As thousands of banks failed, businesses lost access to credit, and consumer spending collapsed. The financial system itself had crumbled, making recovery far more difficult. Government inaction and poor policies. Unlike today, where the government steps in during economic crises, leaders in the early 1930s believed in laissez-faire economics, the idea that the market should correct itself. Instead of providing relief, they raised interest rates and imposed tariffs, making the situation even worse. The lack of social safety nets, like unemployment benefits or bank deposit insurance, meant millions were left with no financial support. A spark that ignited a fire. The stock market crash of 1929 was a major event, but it didn't cause the Great Depression on its own. Instead, it acted as the spark that ignited a financial and economic system already on the verge of collapse. The real causes, bank failures, economic inequality, overproduction, and reckless speculation, had been building for years. The crash shattered public confidence and triggered a downward spiral. As banks failed and businesses collapsed, unemployment skyrocketed. By 1933, over 15 million Americans, nearly 25% of the workforce, were jobless. The stock market crash was dramatic, but the Great Depression was a slow, grinding catastrophe that unfolded over years. So while Black Tuesday marked the beginning of the worst economic crisis in American history, it wasn't the sole cause. Instead, it was the tipping point, the moment when America's economic house of cards came crashing down. The banking collapse. A domino effect. If the stock market crash of 1929 was the spark that ignited the Great Depression, the collapse of the banking system was the fuel that turned it into an economic inferno. While the crash wiped out fortunes and investor confidence, the failure of thousands of banks meant that everyday Americans lost their life savings, businesses couldn't secure loans, and the financial system ground to a halt. This banking disaster was not inevitable. It was made worse by poor policy decisions, a lack of financial protections, and mass panic that triggered a domino effect across the entire economy. Bank runs and failures. A system in free fall. The late 1920s, the American banking system was far weaker than it appeared. Unlike today, where a few large institutions dominate finance, the country's banking landscape was highly fragmented, with thousands of small independent banks. Many of these banks had overextended themselves by offering easy credit throughout the 1920s, providing loans to farmers, businesses, and stock market investors with little oversight. When the economy began to falter, these loans became harder to repay. The situation spiraled out of control when panicked Americans rushed to withdraw their deposits. These bank runs happened because people feared their bank would collapse, and, without any kind of deposit insurance, their money would be lost forever. The irony was that these panics often caused the very collapses people feared. Banks operate on fractional reserves, meaning they only keep a fraction of their deposits in cash at any given time. If too many customers demanded their money at once, the bank simply didn't have enough cash to cover withdrawals. This led to a wave of bank failures. Between 1930 and 1933, over 9,000 banks collapsed across the United States. As each one failed, another domino fell. People lost their savings, businesses couldn't get loans, and economic activity slowed even further. The fear spread quickly, with ordinary Americans withdrawing whatever money they could, only making the crisis worse. Lack of government protection, no safety net for depositors. One of the biggest reasons the banking crisis was so devastating was that there were no federal protections for depositors at the time. Today, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, guarantees bank deposits up to a certain amount, meaning people don't have to panic and withdraw their money if a bank is in trouble. But in the early 1930s, no such system existed. If your bank failed, your savings were gone forever. This lack of protection created a vicious cycle. As more banks failed, more people withdrew their money, making additional bank failures inevitable. Businesses also suffered. Banks that remained open became reluctant to lend, fearing further losses. Without access to credit, companies couldn't pay employees or expand, leading to layoffs and closures. The entire economy was trapped in a downward spiral. The lack of government intervention at this critical moment is one of the biggest reasons why the Great Depression became so severe. Many Americans lost trust in banks altogether, choosing to hoard cash rather than deposit it, further reducing the money available for loans and economic recovery. The Federal Reserve's mistakes, a catastrophic miscalculation at a time when the banking system desperately needed help. The Federal Reserve, the institution designed to stabilize the economy, made the wrong moves. Instead of injecting money into the system to keep banks afloat and restore confidence, the Fed did the opposite. Tightened credit. Instead of expanding it, instead of lowering interest rates and making it easier for banks to lend money, the Federal Reserve raised interest rates, making borrowing more expensive. This choked off access to credit when it was needed most. Failed to act as a lender of last resort. The Federal Reserve was supposed to be the banking system's safety net, stepping in when banks faced liquidity crises. But rather than providing emergency loans to struggling banks, the Fed let them fail, believing it was part of the natural business cycle. This hands-off approach turned a financial crisis into a nationwide catastrophe. Didn't prevent deflation. As banks collapsed and money became scarce, the U.S. entered a period of deflation, where prices and wages fell drastically. While this might sound good on the surface, deflation actually increases the burden of debt because loans remain fixed while incomes shrink. As a result, businesses and farmers who had taken out loans in the 1920s were suddenly drowning in debt they couldn't repay. The Fed's failure to act made the banking crisis far worse than it needed to be. By 1933, the money supply had shrunk by nearly 30%, making recovery almost impossible. Economists today widely agree that if the Federal Reserve had stepped in to stabilize the banking system early on, the Great Depression may have been much shorter and less severe. A domino effect that crushed the economy. The collapse of the banking system was more than just a financial disaster. It had devastating real-world consequences. Businesses couldn't get loans, so they had to lay off workers or close entirely. Farmers, already struggling with low crop prices, lost their land as banks foreclosed on unpaid loans. Millions of people, with no money and no safety net, found themselves homeless and jobless, standing in bread lines just to survive. By 1933, unemployment had skyrocketed to nearly 25%, and industrial production had fallen by more than half. The U.S. economy was in complete freefall. The failure of the banking system wasn't just an effect of the Great Depression, it was one of its biggest causes. The crash of 1929 might have been the initial shock, but it was the banking collapse that turned a recession into the worst economic disaster in history. The lessons learned. The banking crisis of the early 1930s exposed the weaknesses in the American financial system, leading to major reforms. Under Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, the government introduced laws to regulate banks, create deposit insurance, FDIC, and prevent reckless speculation. These protections helped restore confidence in the banking system and ensured that another financial disaster on this scale would never happen again. But at the time, no one knew these reforms were coming. For millions of Americans in the early 1930s, the collapse of the banking system meant the collapse of their entire world. Families lost their homes, workers lost their jobs, and businesses lost everything. The lack of government action only made things worse, and by the time real solutions were put in place, the damage had already been done. The banking collapse of the Great Depression serves as a stark reminder of what happens when financial systems are left unchecked and when governments fail to act in times of crisis. It wasn't just one bank or one bad decision that caused the economy to crumble. It was a chain reaction, a domino effect that brought an entire nation to its knees. The Dust Bowl and agricultural crisis. When the land turned to dust, the Great Depression wasn't just a financial catastrophe, it was an environmental and agricultural disaster as well. As banks failed and businesses collapsed, millions of Americans lost their jobs and savings. But in the rural heartland of the United States, a different kind of devastation was unfolding. The Dust Bowl, a period of severe drought and dust storms, during the 1930s turned vast stretches of farmland into a barren wasteland. Entire communities were wiped out as crops failed, livestock died, and families were forced to abandon their homes in search of survival. This crisis wasn't just a natural disaster. It was the result of decades of poor agricultural practices, combined with a harsh and unforgiving climate shift. The consequences were catastrophic, leading to one of the largest migrations in American history and intensifying the suffering of the Great Depression. Overfarming and the rise of the Dust Bowl. The roots of the Dust Bowl stretched back to the early 20th century. Following World War I, American farmers experienced a boom in agriculture as European demand for wheat and other crops soared. To keep up with demand, farmers across the Great Plains plowed up millions of acres of native grasslands, replacing them with wheat fields. However, this intense expansion came at a cost. The Great Plains had always been a fragile ecosystem, with deep-rooted prairie grasses that held the soil in place. When those grasses were removed and replaced with endless rows of crops, the land became vulnerable to erosion. Farmers also used mechanized plowing techniques that exposed the topsoil, making it even more susceptible to being blown away by strong winds. At first, these changes didn't seem like a problem, especially during the wet years of the 1920s, when rainfall was plentiful and crops thrived. But when the drought hit in the early 1930s, the consequences were devastating. The arrival of the dust storms. With little rainfall and the topsoil exposed, the winds began to pick up the dry earth, creating massive dust storms that swept across the Great Plains. These storms were like rolling walls of dirt, sometimes reaching thousands of feet high and stretching for hundreds of miles. Black Sunday, April 14, 1935, one of the worst dust storms in American history. Winds reaching 60 mph carried $300,000 tons of topsoil into the air, turning day into night and covering towns in thick dust. Many believed it was the end of the world. Health hazards. The dust wasn't just an inconvenience, it was deadly. Fine particles got into people's lungs, causing a condition known as dust pneumonia, which led to respiratory infections and even death. Animals and crops died. The dust storms buried entire farms, choking crops and killing livestock. Without grass to graze on, cattle starved. Farmers who had once been prosperous were suddenly unable to grow anything, and with no crops to sell, they had no income to pay their debts. Economic collapse in rural America as crops failed. Farm incomes plummeted by 50% in the early 1930s. Farmers who had taken out loans to buy land or equipment suddenly found themselves unable to make payments. Banks, already in crisis from the stock market crash and banking collapse, began seizing farms and foreclosing on land. Many farmers desperately tried to stay afloat by planting even more crops, hoping that higher yields would offset their losses. But this only made the problem worse. Flooding the market with surplus wheat and corn drove prices even lower, making it even harder for farmers to make a living. By the mid-1930s, over 750,000 farms were lost to foreclosure, and millions of people in rural America found themselves with nowhere to turn. Mass migration, the Okies and the Great Exodus. With their farms destroyed and no way to make a living, millions of people were forced to leave their homes, searching for work elsewhere. Many of these desperate families, especially from Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and Arkansas, headed west to California, hoping to find jobs on fruit farms or in urban centers. These migrants, often referred to as Okies, faced intense discrimination when they arrived. They were seen as outsiders, willing to work for low wages and competing with local laborers for jobs. California was not the paradise they had dreamed of. Instead of finding stable work, many ended up in migrant camps, living in extreme poverty. This mass migration was famously depicted in John Steinbeck's novel, The Grapes of Wrath, which told the story of the Joad family's journey from Oklahoma to California, capturing the desperation and hardship faced by thousands of displaced farmers. Government response and the New Deal, the Dust Bowl and the agricultural crisis forced the federal government to take action. Under Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, several programs were introduced to help struggling farmers and restore the land. The Soil Conservation Service, 1935, encouraged farmers to use sustainable farming techniques, such as crop rotation, contour plowing, and planting trees to act as windbreaks. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, 1933, paid farmers to reduce crop production in an attempt to stabilize prices and prevent overproduction. Resettlement programs helped displaced farmers relocate and provided financial assistance for those who lost their land. Slowly, these policies began to improve conditions, but it wasn't until the late 1930s, when rainfall returned to normal levels and farming methods changed, that the Dust Bowl finally began to fade. The lasting impact of the Dust Bowl, the Dust Bowl, was one of the worst environmental disasters in American history, and its effects were felt for decades. It exposed the dangers of unsustainable farming, led to major changes in agricultural policy, and contributed to the broader suffering of the Great Depression. But it also shaped American culture in profound ways. The stories of resilience, migration, and survival became ingrained in the national consciousness, influencing literature, music, and film. The experience of the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression would leave a lasting mark on American society, reminding future generations of the fragility of both the land and the economy. For the millions who lived through it, the Dust Bowl wasn't just an economic crisis. It was a battle for survival against forces that seemed beyond their control. And for those who made it through, the lessons learned would shape the future of farming, conservation, and government intervention in times of crisis. Tariffs and bad government policies. How the Smoot-Hawley tariff and economic missteps deepened. The Great Depression. If the stock market crash, banking failures, and Dust Bowl weren't enough, poor government policies added fuel to the fire of the Great Depression. One of the most disastrous decisions was the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, a well-intentioned but deeply flawed economic policy that ended up making the crisis much worse. Instead of protecting American industries as it was supposed to, it triggered a global trade war that shrank international markets and deepened the economic collapse. At the same time, President Herbert Hoover's hands-off approach and failure to provide direct relief left millions of Americans struggling to survive. This combination of bad policy, economic nationalism, and governmental inaction ensured that the Great Depression would not only continue, but spiral into one of the longest and most devastating economic crises in history. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff, a self-inflicted economic wound. During the late 1920s, many American businesses and farmers were already struggling, despite the apparent economic prosperity of the decade. Cheap European imports were cutting into profits, and farmers were dealing with falling crop prices caused by overproduction. To solve this problem, two U.S. legislators, Senator Reed Smoot and Representative Willis Hawley, introduced a tariff bill in 1929. Their goal was to protect American businesses and farmers from foreign competition by raising taxes on imported goods, making them more expensive and encouraging Americans to buy domestically made products instead. This idea, known as protectionism, had been used before in U.S. history, but this time it would backfire in a spectacularly disastrous way. What did the Smoot-Hawley tariff actually do? The bill raised tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods, sometimes by more than 60%. It aimed to shield American manufacturers and farmers from foreign competition. It was signed into law by President Hoover in June 1930, despite warnings from economists. However, the timing could not have been worse. When the bill was first proposed in 1929, the economy was still booming. But by the time it became law in mid-1930, the stock market had already crashed, and economic conditions were rapidly deteriorating. Instead of helping American businesses, the tariff set off a chain reaction of global economic retaliation that made things even worse. Retaliation. The global trade war begins. The Smoot-Hawley tariff was an economic disaster because the United States was not the only country struggling. Other nations were also facing economic downturns and looking for ways to protect their own industries. When the U.S. raised tariffs, other countries struck back by placing their own tariffs on American goods. Canada, America's largest trading partner, imposed retaliatory tariffs on U.S. agricultural products, leading to a massive decline in U.S. farm exports. European nations, including Britain, France, and Germany, responded with their own protectionist policies, shutting American businesses out of key markets. U.S. exports fell by more than 60% by 1933, worsening the economic downturn at home. In Niyamunbayan, short international trade ground to a halt. Before the tariff, the United States had been one of the world's largest exporters of manufactured goods and agricultural products. But after the law took effect, global demand for American goods collapsed, leaving U.S. businesses and farmers without foreign buyers. The impact on American farmers and industry. The effects of the Smoot-Hawley tariff were devastating, particularly for American farmers who had already been struggling due to overproduction and low crop prices. Before the tariff, American farmers relied on foreign markets to sell their surplus wheat, cotton, and other crops. Once foreign countries imposed their own tariffs on U.S. farm products, farmers had nowhere to sell their goods. As a result, farm prices dropped even further, and many farmers lost their land to foreclosure. The situation was just as bad for American manufacturers. Before the tariff, many industries exported goods to Europe and Latin America. But with trade barriers in place, factories had fewer customers, leading to mass layoffs and higher unemployment. Rather than saving American jobs, the Smoot-Hawley tariff actually cost jobs by shrinking the economy even further. Hoover's inaction. The economy will fix itself. As the economic situation worsened, President Herbert Hoover refused to take aggressive action to provide relief. His laissez-faire, hands-off approach to the crisis made things worse, as he believed the economy would eventually self-correct without government intervention. Hoover's biggest mistakes included refusing direct federal relief. Hoover believed that charities and local governments should handle unemployment aid rather than the federal government. As a result, millions of Americans had no safety net as they lost their jobs and homes. Raising taxes. During a depression, instead of cutting taxes to stimulate spending, Hoover signed a massive tax increase in 1932, worsening the economic slowdown. Believing in rugged individualism, Hoover's philosophy emphasized self-reliance, which meant he opposed welfare programs that could have helped struggling Americans. While Hoover did attempt some economic fixes, like creating the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, RFC, to help banks and businesses, his response was widely seen as too little, too late. The end result: a deeper depression by 1932, the Great Depression had become a full-blown economic catastrophe, thanks in large part to bad government policies like the Smoot-Hawley tariff and Hoover's inaction. The numbers tell the story. Unemployment soared to 25%. 1 in 4 Americans was out of work. Industrial production fell by nearly 50% from its pre-crash levels. More than 5,000 banks failed, wiping out people's life savings. International. Trade dropped by over 60%, worsening global economic struggles. These failures set the stage for the election of Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1932, who would usher in a new era of government intervention through the New Deal, attempting to reverse the damage. The long road to recovery. How America climbed out of the Great Depression. By 1932, the United States was trapped in a seemingly endless economic disaster. Unemployment had soared to 25%, banks had collapsed, businesses had shut down, and millions of Americans faced hunger and homelessness. The country was desperate for change. That change came in the form of Franklin D. Roosevelt, whose bold leadership and New Deal programs would attempt to pull America out of the worst economic crisis in its history. However, even with these sweeping reforms, the Great Depression didn't end overnight. In fact, it wasn't until World War II that the U.S. economy truly recovered. Let's take a deep dive into how Roosevelt's New Deal laid the foundation for recovery, and why it took the largest war in history to finally lift America out of economic despair. Franklin D. Roosevelt's election, a nation desperate for hope. The 1932 presidential election was more than just a political contest. It was a referendum on how to fix the economic crisis. The incumbent, Herbert Hoover, had lost the trust of the American people. His policies, including the disastrous Smoot-Hawley tariff and his reluctance to provide direct aid, had deepened the Depression instead of solving it. Enter Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR, the charismatic governor of New York. FDR's campaign focused on optimism, hope, and action. He promised the American people a New Deal, a set of government programs designed to provide relief, recovery, and reform. His message resonated with a nation desperate for leadership, and he won in a landslide victory. One of his first major acts as president was to restore public confidence in the government and the economy. He delivered his famous fireside chats, radio broadcasts that reassured Americans that their government was actively working to solve their problems, but words alone wouldn't be enough. America needed action. The New Deal. America's first attempt at economic recovery, FDR's New Deal, was a sweeping set of government programs aimed at fixing the economy through three key goals: relief, immediate help for those suffering the most; recovery, programs to restart the economy and get people working again; reform, long-term changes to prevent another Great Depression. FDR and Congress quickly got to work, passing over a dozen major laws in his first 100 days in office. These programs fundamentally changed the role of government in American life. Key New Deal programs: banking reforms, fixing the financial system. One of FDR's first priorities was to restore confidence in the banking system, which had collapsed after thousands of banks failed. Emergency Banking Act, 1933, declared a bank holiday, shutting down all banks for 4 days so the government could stabilize them. Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, guaranteed people's bank deposits, ensuring that their money was safe, even if a bank failed. Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, regulated the stock market to prevent risky speculation and fraud, the same reckless behavior that had caused the 1929 crash. Public works projects, putting Americans back to work to fight unemployment. Roosevelt launched massive public works programs that created millions of jobs by hiring people to build roads, bridges, schools, and parks. Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, employed young men to work on environmental projects like planting trees and building national parks. Public Works Administration, PWA, funded large-scale infrastructure projects like dams, highways, and public buildings. Works Progress Administration, WPA, became one of the largest job programs in U.S. history, employing millions of workers in everything from construction to the arts. Economic and labor reforms, protecting workers. And families. FDR's administration introduced major labor protections and welfare programs that would shape American society for decades to come. Social Security Act, 1935, established unemployment insurance, pensions for retirees, and aid for the disabled and poor families. National Labor Relations Act, Wagner Act, guaranteed workers' rights to unionize and bargain for better wages and conditions. Fair Labor Standards Act, 1938, established the minimum wage, a 40-hour workweek, and child labor laws. Did the New Deal end the Great Depression? While the New Deal provided relief and reforms, it did not fully end the Great Depression. Unemployment remained high throughout the 1930s. Many of FDR's programs faced opposition from conservatives, leading to Supreme Court battles. The economy improved, but growth was slow. It wasn't the rapid recovery people had hoped for. The reality was that the New Deal softened the crisis, but didn't completely solve it. Something far bigger would be needed to restart the economy on a massive scale. And that something turned out to be World War II. World War II, the unexpected economic savior. By the late 1930s, war was brewing in Europe and Asia. When World War II broke out in 1939, the United States initially remained neutral, but by 1941, the country was drawn into the conflict after the Way attack on Pearl Harbor. The war effort transformed the American economy overnight. War production and job creation factories that had been shut down during the Great Depression were reopened and expanded to produce weapons, tanks, and airplanes. Unemployment dropped to nearly zero as millions of men joined the military, and millions of women entered the workforce to keep up with war production. The government poured billions of dollars into the economy, fueling industrial growth on a scale never seen before. End of the Depression. By 1944, the U.S. economy had doubled in size compared to its lowest point during the Great Depression. Rationing and war bonds encouraged consumer saving, meaning that after the war, Americans had money to spend, leading to an economic boom in the late 1940s and 1950s. New technologies and scientific advancements from the war, such as radar, aviation, and medicine, helped fuel future industries. Ultimately, it was World War II, not the New Deal, that fully ended the Great Depression. The massive government spending, industrial mobilization, and job creation required by the war pushed the economy back into full gear. Conclusion: the long road to recovery. The Great Depression was the worst economic crisis in American history, but FDR's leadership and the New Deal laid the foundation for recovery. The New Deal created safety nets, such as Social Security and labor protections, that still exist today. Massive public works projects provided millions of jobs and reshaped America's infrastructure. Financial reforms helped stabilize the banking system, preventing future crashes. However, the Depression wasn't fully defeated until the war economy kicked in during World War II. The war effort created millions of jobs, boosted industrial production, and revived the global economy. So, was the Great Depression solved by government programs, or did war ultimately save the economy? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Lessons from the Great Depression. Could it happen again? The Great Depression was a devastating economic disaster, but it wasn't just a historical event. It was a wake-up call. The policies, mistakes, and lessons from this period reshaped modern economics, influencing how governments respond to financial crises even today. But are we truly protected from another Great Depression? Or could a similar catastrophe happen again? Let's break down the key lessons from the Great Depression, the safeguards in place today, and whether we're still vulnerable to another collapse. The importance of financial regulations. Of the biggest causes of the Great Depression was the unregulated stock market and reckless banking practices. Banks gambled with depositors' money, and millions of Americans invested in stocks using borrowed money, margin buying, a recipe for disaster. When the crash came, banks failed, people lost their savings, and the entire system collapsed. Lesson learned: governments must regulate financial markets to prevent excessive risk-taking and protect consumers. Modern safeguards: the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, established to monitor and regulate the stock market, preventing fraud and reckless speculation. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, guarantees bank deposits up to a certain limit, ensuring people don't lose their money if a bank fails. Impact: these regulations helped prevent another 1929-style crash. Even during the 2008 financial crisis, the FDIC prevented bank runs and saved millions of depositors from financial ruin. The role of government in economic recovery. Before the Great Depression, the U.S. government had a hands-off approach to the economy. President Herbert Hoover believed the economy would fix itself and refused to provide direct aid to struggling Americans. This inaction made the crisis worse and prolonged suffering. Lesson learned. In times of economic crisis, government intervention is necessary to stabilize the economy and support citizens. Modern safeguards, Social Security, established. During the New Deal, this provides financial support for retirees, the unemployed, and disabled Americans. Unemployment insurance helps people stay afloat after losing their jobs, preventing widespread poverty. Stimulus programs. During economic downturns, the government can inject money into the economy, e.g., stimulus checks, infrastructure, projects. Impact. These policies helped cushion the blow during recessions. For example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, stimulus payments and unemployment benefits helped prevent a full-scale depression. 3. Global trade matters. Tariffs can backfire. One of the worst decisions during the Great Depression was the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, 1930, which raised tariffs on imported goods to protect American industries. The problem? Other countries retaliated with their own tariffs, leading to a collapse in global trade. Instead of protecting the economy, it worsened the crisis by killing exports and worsening unemployment. Lesson learned. Trade wars can deepen economic crises instead of solving them. Modern safeguards. Free trade agreements. Countries now rely on global trade partnerships to prevent a repeat of the 1930s tariff disaster. International cooperation. Organizations like the World Trade Organization, WTO, and International Monetary Fund, IMF, help stabilize global markets. Impact. Governments today are more cautious about imposing extreme tariffs, understanding that economic isolation can worsen crises. However, trade tensions, like the US-China trade war, still pose risks. Could another Great Depression happen again? Despite these safeguards, some experts still worry about the possibility of another Great Depression. Here's why. Debt and speculation. Many of the problems from the 1920s still exist today, like excessive borrowing, stock market bubbles, and risky financial products. The 2008 financial crisis was a warning sign of how fragile the system can be. Income inequality. The wealth gap is wider than ever, similar to the 1920s. When too much wealth is concentrated at the top, consumer spending slows, which can hurt economic growth. Global shocks, events like pandemics, wars, or energy crises can trigger severe economic downturns, just as the 1929 crash did. However, there's also hope. Governments now react much faster. During the 2008 crisis and COVID-19 pandemic, emergency measures, like bank bailouts and stimulus payments, helped prevent total economic collapse. More economic tools exist. The Federal Reserve can adjust interest rates, inject money into the economy, and prevent deflation, mistakes that worsened the Great Depression. International cooperation is stronger. Global financial institutions work together to prevent economic disasters, unlike in the 1930s when countries acted alone. Final thoughts. What can we learn? The Great Depression changed everything, teaching us that financial markets need strong regulations to prevent reckless speculation. Government intervention is crucial in stabilizing the economy during crises. Global trade policies matter. Tariffs can backfire and worsen recessions. We must stay vigilant. History shows that economic disasters can happen again if we ignore the warning signs. What do you think? Could another Great Depression happen? Are modern safeguards enough to prevent total economic collapse? Let us know in the comments. Outro. Lessons from the Great Depression. The Great Depression was more than just a stock market crash. It was a perfect storm of economic failures, from bank collapses and government inaction to trade wars and environmental disasters. It changed the way we view finance, government intervention, and global trade forever. So, what do you think? What was the biggest cause of the Great Depression? Was it the stock market crash, bad banking policies, or something else? Let's discuss in the comments. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. We explore the past to understand the present, because history always has lessons to teach us. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.